just talking. Casual talk.
Casual talk.
Casual. I mean, these are mostly journalists.
Oh, great.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondent Club of Thailand. I'm Panu Wongchaum, and I'll be your moderator for today. Of course, tonight's event is organized crime and the drug trade in Southeast Asia. And as you can see, we have a distinguished panel here today to talk about this shift, in the drug trade. The famous Golden Triangle for decades have been notorious, for illicit drug smuggling that goes from throughout the region and throughout the world even. And as we know, we have seen that the number of drugs busted or confiscated by authorities around this region has increased significantly over the past decade, even over the past few years. So I just want to briefly introduce our panelists for tonight. We have Khun Jeremy Douglas, who's the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime regional representative, who will talk to us about this broad shift. And with him also we have Mr. Inchik Sim, who's a research officer, the UNODC, who has maybe a lot of revealing data about the sort of current state of the drug trade in the region. And of course we have Khun Paisit Songkahapong, Deputy Secretary General of the Office of the Narcotics Control Board of Thailand, who's here to talk to us about sort of the pictures here, the situation here in Thailand. And lastly, but not least, we have Patrick Wynn, award-winning journalist and authors of Hello Shadowlands Inside the Meth Fiefdoms, Rebel Hideouts and Bomb-Scared Party Towns of Southeast Asia. Of course, he's no stranger to this topic, having covered this issue for many years. So I would like to start with Jeremy. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of this, the situation right now of the drug trade in Southeast Asia? How has it changed from the yesteryears of that image of warlords smuggling drugs through donkeys, through the mountain hideouts or whatever in the Golden Triangle? What is the drug trade right now?
Thanks, Panu. And first, appreciate you putting this panel together. It's a really good opportunity for us to explain from our perspective how this situation has changed. And I'd like to acknowledge my panelists, Patrick and Khun Paisith and Inchik, with whom I work closely. I'll draw on as I talk to you, I'll draw on my 18 years here. I've had 2 runs in the region. So I had a chance, 2002 to 7, to witness a certain kind of a drug trade. And then the last 7 years, witnessing a very different kind of drug trade. And that different kind of drug trade, as Panu has mentioned, has profound impacts within the region, but actually it has global reach now, which at one time it had a bit of global reach, but not on the scale that it has now.
Sorry
I'll use that's quite all right, this is fine. Thank you. So I'll draw on that kind of background and draw the picture for you, and then let my colleagues, go into different types of detail where they can. As he said, there used to be this concept of warlords, people carrying drugs to the mountains. We hear of Khun Sa, we hear of these mythic figures from the past that were involved in the drug trade. But there's been an evolution that has taken place over the past 5-6 years particularly, since the time, 20 plus years ago when they were really active and they were the ones that were driving the trade. And I recall in 2002, when I started my first assignment here, I was working on a yaba intelligence and precursor intelligence program. And yaba being the little pink pills that we see shoved all over Thailand to drug users. At that time, the drug trade or the yaba trade was the secondary trade in the region. So you had heroin was still the big profit the big profit spinner for Khun Sa, for those types of characters up in Shan State. Yaba was kind of the secondary, you heard about the truck drivers, the taxi drivers, and so on and so forth using it, right? So it was also a mom and pop shop trade in some respects initially in the 90s when they started making it. You had little pill presses, often hand cranked, or some guy with an electric belt motor that was cranking out pills in the mountains and shipping. At that time, you would hear of the big seizure in Bangkok, 100,000 yaba tablets, 200,000. Massive seizures were 500,000 yaba tablets. Those seizures don't get mentioned anymore at all because they're essentially irrelevant. Then we saw the WA in northern Myanmar really scale the trade. Okay, so you all know who the WA are, and I'm sure Patrick will enlighten you greatly because he knows them very well. I'll let you elaborate how,
Sure.
but we know things, Patrick.
I know things.
But the point is that they had the ability to scale, okay? But really that was a scale that was hitting Thailand. And then when they hit the big scale, or bigger scale, say 2004, 5, 6, that's when they started hitting Cambodia with the supply. They started hitting Laos with the supply because the Thai market was becoming saturated. And you'll recall the Thai war on drugs, the initial Thai war on drugs, 2003 with Thaksin, and the attempt to do something about it through that approach, and how that worked or didn't, and ended up essentially creating a pattern of policing in the region, which is more or less on a repeat pattern now. But again, I would say, if you think about the organized crime involvement, it was very, how would I describe it, localized at that time. So the characters involved were Mekong focused. There were international criminals that were sourcing Golden Triangle heroin from those localized warlords and organized crime figures that were active up in Shan, and shipping it to Los Angeles, shipping it to North America, Europe. But really, it was a localized kind of crime. So then you flip forward to where we are a few years later, 2000. When I came back 2013, that's when there actually happened to be a massive shift in the approach, the revolution and shift that Panu initially kind of touched on there. So we had this stasis in between, this kind of equilibrium with the local supply. And actually, because this is Southeast Asia, just depart 1 second, there was a shabu market. For those that don't know shabu, it's crystal meth, but it's Philippines, it was Indonesia, it was Malaysia. Coinciding with the yaba market of the Mekong, no crystal in this market, and heroin here in the Mekong. And of course, the countries vacillated between what was the big drug that was hitting their market, their treatment systems, their policing systems, and so forth. Then you shift forward. So I go back to what I was talking about before, the 2013-14 period. There was a very big, significant event that took place that no one in this room really saw coming. No one in the region really understood the implications of that until 2016-ish. But 2013-14, the government of China went after methamphetamine trafficking. They did that for a very particular reason. They were under significant international pressure to address the fact that they had become a major source of methamphetamine for several other countries, Japan, Australia, and other locations. So we had the Chinese government essentially very successfully, from a domestic policing or policy perspective, go after the methamphetamine trade. But what that did was it really displaced the characters and the production involved. To put it in perspective, there was a lab that was seized in a place called Lufeng in Boshe in southern China in, I think it was 2014. We've written about it, actually. And that particular facility was the biggest methamphetamine facility ever seen in the history of the world to that point. And that includes, actually for a few years post that event, the biggest methamphetamine facility that would have ever been seized, say, even in Mexico, Latin America. That scale. It was a whole town that was employed producing methamphetamine. And that town was shipping that methamphetamine all over the place. That production was displaced. And the people behind it, the financiers, looked for a home, a place they could put their production that wouldn't be affected. And they looked very close by, and they saw the Golden Triangle. And essentially what they did was they reactivated some old contacts. And they gave them a call or something to that effect, and they said, we've got an opportunity for you. Are you ready to do some business with us? And they shifted their production into different parts of Shan, but primarily into North Shan. They hedged their bets a little bit and they put it in different locations, but primarily into North Shan, where they set up factories, many of which are still running, that essentially produce on a scale of that Bochet facility that I described, but they do it in a place where they can't be touched. Okay, so there is no authority that can go in to take them out. Now, what they did at that point was they decided that they were going to shift the drug market in Southeast Asia, in the Mekong, and they were going to shift it across Southeast Asia, and it had global implications when they did that. So that shift was to essentially move away and convince those groups, in a sense, that methamphetamine was the future. Synthetic drugs of different kinds, and my colleague Inchik can elaborate a couple of other kinds in a moment. But the point is, synthetic were the shift that they decided to engineer. And so what they did was they moved in this big production, they started scaling it and flooding the region with crystal meth. Now, they were selling it at different price points. So the Mekong has a certain price point, North Shan had one, Thailand had one, Malaysia had another, Indonesia had another, and all the way down the chain until the high profit margin points of sale, Australia, New Zealand, Japan were the ultimate destination for them, where they could make the big, big profits. And there's a reason for that. You can get 250,000 Australian for a kilo there. In Shan State, you sell it in North Shan for $8,000, give or take. Okay, so it's a huge markup along that chain, right? So they were targeting those ultimate markets, but really flooding the region. So they scaled production to such an extent that they flooded Asia with meth, and they started that in 2014-15. We started seeing signatures of that through, some of you would have seen in the media, tea bags. Now there's a connection between the variety of different tea bags that float around that we can't really describe, but there's a connection between them. And there's different signatures of different profiles of crystal meth within the different bags that go to different locations because there's different purity levels and so on and so forth. But what they did was they engineered this push of them across the region. It's like a branding technique in a sense, a quality signal. They've done that with heroin for years, branded certain kind of heroin as high quality. They started doing the same with meth. The other thing they did was they shifted the yaba trade. So they scaled yaba production as well. So those little guys that were running the hand crank pill presses and the electric belt motor pill presses were essentially put out of business. Those guys now carry the yaba that other guys produce. And you see this in the seizures. So as I said, a huge, enormous seizure in Bangkok in 2005 was 500,000 tablets. Maybe 1 million was the record. The whole region sees 20 or 30 million. Now you have loads of yaba coming down through central Thailand that are 20 million, that are 10 million tablets, and they're seized in that scale. And they can afford to lose them because they produce on such a volume for the purpose of flooding the market, for the purpose of building demand. So they started that process with yaba to consolidate the production in there. They consolidated the production of crystal meth from across the region into Shan State. You no longer see production, by the way, in the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia. It's essentially gone. It's now all been centralized into this particular location. So they did that, they split the methamphetamine market, two forms, crystal and yaba, scaled both, flooded the region. At the same time, the heroin trade started declining. So you really see the shift away from heroin. And I touched on a point earlier, which I'll elaborate now, is about the profit. You know, you don't need people to produce methamphetamine. So this room here, the FCCT, could be a meth factory. Equivalent scale, like equivalent size, right? And you could produce 50 tons, 10 tons a ton. It's up to you, it's up to the scale you can do it, it's up to your chemists and the chemicals you have. So they essentially shifted to that model of high volume and pure profit, not needing people. So you displace the workers. It's a very different business and a profit spinner and wealth concentrator for organized crime. So you can't look at the old paradigm, the one I described in 2002, where the profits were heroin and yaba was that little business. It's now a completely different business. And you can't talk about it in the same way, and nor should you think about it in the same way, nor should you think about the response in the same way. You have to have a very, very different response. And yet it's still talked about in many respects the same way, and I don't think the media have caught on to this change adequately. They still report seizures, basically. They still talk about that. So that's the big fundamental shift that took place. Now, on the back of that, the money generated has been enormous. So between 2015 and 2014 and the point we're at now, we went from a business that was, in Czech, maybe 10 billion a year, give it a little more than that, right? To now 60 plus billion dollars a year. So there's not a lot of businesses in the world that can scale like that. And that's what they've managed to do. Now, to move the money they make, they needed mechanisms. And the other thing that took place in China at that time, actually not mainland, but Macau, the special administrative region, was the displacement of money laundering from there into the Mekong, which took place more or less around the same time. They went after corruption and money laundering at that same time off the mainland through Macau. And the displacement into this region has been significant. You see Sihanoukville, you see the border regions of this country, and what do you see? You see special economic zones, and you see casinos. And that's where they've moved that element of their business. So I think the final point I would make before I turn it over, I've described kind of the shift, and then how some related crimes have taken place. But I think we also need to think about, again, that response that we need to have together. Thailand, the region, and those of us that help the region. It has to be different. The scale is different, the type of impact is different, and it can't be approached using that same old policing paradigm. We have to use a different approach to that. So anyways, I'll finish at that, and look forward to a bit of discussion and debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. You gave us a very broad view from UNODC's perspective about this massive shift that had taken place. I want to go to Patrick now. He can tell us a bit about how, as a reporter, reporting this kind of this whole issue, this shift. Can you tell us a little bit about what you saw change and what is the state now that you see? And I know that you've been, your work speaks for itself. You have captured this issue in many different locations in Southeast Asia. So tell us a bit about that. Thank you.
Yeah, sure thing. So my name is Patrick Nguyen. I'm an author and investigative journalist. Actually, my day job is with the radio show called The World that's on NPR stations in the US, but I have to make it clear, I think that I'm speaking for myself tonight. So I cover the drug trade as a specialty. I'm not with any organization or government, so I don't have a policy agenda to win any war on drugs or to even see certain people locked up. I'm just covering the drug trade the same way other reporters would cover, say, Wall Street. So I don't assume the people I talk to are any more or less moral than people on Wall Street. And I also try to talk to both sides. So I would be more than happy to talk to people on the law enforcement side, but I also try to interview drug users, drug traffickers, indigenous groups who live around the drug trade, various armed groups on the border, and I'm trying to collect their stories, usually anonymously. And all I'm trying to do is glue together a big picture of how the drug trade works. The UNODC, they produce a lot of valuable data, and they talk to all of the policing agencies around the region, like the Bobosaw, the ONCB, to provide that big picture. So I'm trying to do that only with stories. So that's what I do. Big picture. It's been 50 years since the US launched the war on drugs, and it's now cost more than $1 trillion. It's locked up millions and millions of people, and it's launched all sorts of adventures overseas. In Southeast Asia, Thailand has been one of America's best friends in this war. And many Thai agents are trained by the US and get assistance from the US. And like the US, Thailand has locked up a lot of people for drugs. The prisons are pretty full. And yet people are still doing drugs. And I don't just mean cannabis either. It's my personal opinion that I don't really think that anybody who does hard drugs belongs in a cage, not for a few days, not for a few years, certainly. And yet the prisons, like I said, are quite full. I think Thailand is at a crossroads right now. Does it want to keep sort of following the doctrine that's been set by the war on drugs, or does it want to go its own way? I mean, if you look at the US right now, is this a country that you truly want to imitate? Do you think we've got it all figured out? I think now is actually an interesting time for Thailand because you do actually have people who are very senior in the anti-narcotics world who do want to see some changes. I don't think those changes are going to be radical, but there are people who are very high-ranking who are interested in change. So that's my first part of my spiel. The second part is I kind of want to make myself useful and talk about this in a way that I think might be diplomatically difficult for some of the other panelists. So the big question is, where are these drugs produced? This is a really great overview by Jeremy. But as he pointed out, it's in Myanmar, mainly in the northern hills and mountains. And they're produced by two types of groups. You have indigenous armed groups that want some form of autonomy. And then you have these militias that are operating under the military of Myanmar. So my research, and with the drug trade, you never know for sure. Like, this is a very murky trade. You never know if exactly what you've heard is exactly right. But my findings seem to suggest that it's the second group, the militias that operate in conjunction with Myanmar's military, that are producing more at this moment in time. In Burmese, they're called Pitusit, and they're located in parts of the country that are difficult for the army to control. Just picture a couple hundred to 1,000 guys with guns in uniforms who say to the army, hey, we will hold down this area for you. We got this, but you got to let us do what we got to do. It's kind of a wink-wink thing. Like most governments, like the United States, like Thailand, Myanmar's army cares more about land and territory and power than drugs. So they say, okay, it's a deal they're willing to make. Now, none of these soldiers, these militia soldiers, know chemistry or how to run a meth lab. And so invariably they get approached by an outside syndicate, maybe some of the people that left parts of China that Jeremy discussed, and they get approached and they get offered a deal. This outside group will come in and set up the methamphetamine factory. They may do the smuggling out as well. And all they want to hear is, can you offer us land and protection? Can you offer us a place to do this where we won't get raided? Yes? Okay, deal. Boom. And so the next time you see methamphetamine seized on the border, I would imagine that it's produced through those means in a place like that. What about the first group I mentioned, the groups that are against the government or fighting for more autonomy? They may be involved in production too. They may be involved in taxing smugglers that come through their area. They may have their fingers in the drug trade in some way as well. Frankly, it's a little crazy not to tap into the drug trade if you are in that area, because that really defines the economy, and there's not much else going on, not many other ways to make money other than extractive resources. So it makes a lot of sense for them to dabble in the drug trade, or more than dabble in the drug trade. So they are involved too, some more or less than others, but I do think production has shifted way over to the army-backed militias. And I will say, and this is a bit taboo, there are pros and cons to that. I think because there's some state buy-in that actually prevents some of the really horrendous violence you see in the US-Mexico border. I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A if anyone wants to hear my theories. But the last point I'll make, and this is also a bit taboo, but who controls the land on the other side of the Thai border? I'm talking about going north of the Thai border. If you look on Google Maps, it says Myanmar, but it's much more complicated than that. It's Myanmar's army plus a lot of the little militias I mentioned, plus several indigenous armed groups. And it's really complicated, but to simplify, a lot of that territory is run by the United Wa State Army. Altogether, this group controls more land than Israel or Belgium. And they have their own government with their own flags and their own anthem and their own schools and their own roads and everything. I mean, it's a pretty high-functioning government in, well, at least more than you might think. And so this Wa army is commonly blamed as the boogeyman at the center of the drug trade, or at least it has been in years past. I do think that that's starting to sound a little outdated. You know, this is a group that has historically sat on some of the most bountiful poppy growing lands in the world, and 15 years ago they cut them all down. And that means leaving a lot of money on the table and putting their economy at risk. Why did they do that? Is because there's a strain within that government that really wants to be accepted and treated seriously by the world. What are their goals? Well, they don't want to split off from Myanmar. They want to have something that's more like one country, two systems, like China has with Hong Kong and Macau. And, you know, they say, well, you say we're nothing but drug lords, but we did wipe out our poppies. The US policy is still to disrupt and dismantle the UWSA and put its leaders in prison, and that would essentially wipe out much of the executive branch of this government. And because the US is so strong, it makes everyone afraid to deal with them or even give their government aid. So I've always thought that there might be an opportunity there to work with the Wa government and collaborate with them more and find some common ground. Myanmar might not like it. Human rights groups probably won't like it. There are lots of groups that won't like it. But I do think, you know, if agencies outside of that area worked with them more, you might have a clearer picture of what's going on that border. And I have spoken with a few Wa officers. They're not easy to get in touch with, but the people I've spoken with are intelligent, serious people. I tend to think that their government is a lot like any government. You have some leaders who are brilliant and kind and others who are pretty bad. And my point is that it is a real honest-to-God government, and it's not one that is trying to split off from the country of Myanmar, so they're not exactly rebels. So there's lots of places in what I've just said to be cynical. Trust me, I've heard it all. But just realize that when you give some of these groups the label as bad guys, you also give them zero incentives to cooperate. Maybe diplomacy would work. I don't know. What we're doing now clearly is not working. So that's just one idea to do things differently. I'm happy to take any questions during Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks, Patrick. Next, we've been seeing sort of the broader picture of sort of, you know, the drug trade. I just want to bring us closer to home on a more micro level, looking at Thailand with Deputy Secretary Paisit. Can you tell us a little bit about the situation? I mean, we're looking at this sort of big shift in the drug trade. What is, you know, from the Thai perspective, I mean, you know, Thailand has long been this path, this route, this pathway for the drug trade. What is it now, Khun Paisit?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me clearly? Okay, right. So, as the moderator said, I will try to narrow down a little bit. Since Khun Jeremy and Khun Patrick already talked about the big picture, I will narrow down to Thailand. So I will talk about the drug situation in Thailand. As you well know, that the major drug production site is in Golden Triangles, right? It has been like this for almost 50 years, and it will be for some time. What they do is they're producing drugs. In the past, they're producing, you may know, opiums, right? But in recent years, we found that the opium cultivations has been decreased. the less heroines, less opiums. But what happened instead of that is that now they're producing, they call synthetic drugs, which is called methamphetamines, crystal amphetamines, which in Thailand, the methamphetamine we call yaba, crystal amphetamine we call ice. Those are those two sorts of drugs that being produced in those triangles. Once they produce it, where they go? They go to everywhere. They go to China, they go to India, they go by sea, they go by land, they go by air as well. A lot of them go through Thailand as market and as a transit. We have those problems. A lot of drug smuggling through north of Thailand and also northeastern part of Thailand as well. And then just recently we found that some of them trying to smuggling through the west of Thailand, which is near Kanchanaburi, that area. Once they get into Thailand, where they go? A lot of them go to south of Thailand straight away. Some go to Bangkok or near Bangkok, where they have the place that they can rest those drugs before being distributed or being transited to the third countries. This is our problems. The Thai government, Royal Thai Police, ONCB, military, trying to work together to set up a lot of checkpoints, doing a lot of surveillance. And we made a lot of arrests during the past few years. But the problem is still there. So we try to look back and try to find a way to solve this problem. Because no matter how much drugs you seize, no matter how much offender you arrest, they still have someone come instead. And that the drugs, more drugs, because now the yaba is easy to produce. In Golden Triangle, they have the factory and they have new machine. They're using hydraulic machine now. Not like before that they used to do that, but with hydraulics, they can produce yaba. In 1 hour is 100,000 easily. So they don't care how much they're going to lose. They're going to be seized along the way. They don't care. So we, Thai governments, with UNODC and with our neighboring countries in Mekong sub-regions, which consists of Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and China. We work together and we came up with the idea of, we call Safe Mekong Plan. And then from that plan, we set up we call the operation Golden Triangle Operations 1511. 1511 stands for the 15th of November. This is the day that we all agree and we sign agreement together with the help of UNODC. Our aim from that operation is that not only to stop the drugs or arrest offender, but we are focusing on the precursor and chemicals. Because without precursor, without chemical, it's very hard for them to produce the drugs. That's why we focusing on that. And since the operation started December last year until now, 6-7 months, we managed to arrest of precursor. We intercept a lot of chemical being smuggling into those factory, the production site in Golden Triangle. A lot of them using the Mekong River shipping, some smuggling to the road by land. So that we are working on that because we believe that no precursor, no drugs. That is one way of to solving or to lessen the problems. For the drugs, the most famous drug that found in Thailand, is yaba, right? The number one right now. The second one now coming very close is ice, crystal amphetamine. But the crystal amphetamine still being used in the certain groups of people or certain places because it's more expensive. They're usually used in the entertainment places or people, Thailand we call high-so, a little bit high-so, not low-so. Okay, so that's ice. The third may be heroin still, because heroin mostly being shipped out, transit to third countries. But our intelligence found recently that now Thai people, Thai drugs user, some of them start coming to use heroin. They use it and they mix it with yaba. That's very dangerous, especially for the young people, because of the purities, of those drugs is very, very intensive. So that is a problem that we are trying to find. Because I think a couple of months ago in United States they found that a lot of people die of using heroin with fentanyl, right? They use both. Very dangerous. We hope that that case not happen in Thailand. So that's the drugs. Cannabis, some yes, smuggling from Laos, from northern side. And ecstasy now being shipped or being smuggled from Europe to Thailand. They use on the as the ice, the certain groups, young people in the entertainment places. A couple of months ago, we managed to arrest Thai students who order ecstasy from Europe, and they ship it by mail, parcel, sent into his condo. And he distributed, he sold it, and he been doing that for 3 years. He made he ordered a lot of shipment. He made a lot of money. So with this case, we work with our European colleagues to liaison officer here. They have their police liaison officer here to trace back and to try to find the person who really sell those ecstasy to these young student, Thai young student here. So that is an overview of situation right now. And we also have another, we call plan to tackle these drug syndicates. I told you already that we focus to the precursor and chemical, right? Another things we looking at right now is their assets. their money. With our government policy now, Prime Minister and Minister of Justice, ONCB, Royal Thai Police, and also another agency concerned, focusing on the forfeitures, assets forfeitures. We managed to do, we start doing that, and we hope that in the few months, we'll be able to make more progress. Last month, there was a big raid in the golden shop. If you read the newspaper or watch television, gold shop in Bangkok, right? And that's linked to another shop around Thailand, especially down the south of Thailand. And they're using the gold shop as the place to laundering the money from the drug syndicates. So we are attacking them, right? Using our law and also using our AMLO, money laundering law. This is our tool. We seize it, money, there is money, and the burden of proof fell into them. They have to come forward and tell us that how much money they have, where they get it from. If they cannot clarify, they cannot explain it to us, then we seize it. It's hurt. It's really hurt. Once they have no money, that's hurt. They don't care people being arrested. They don't care, drug being seized. But the money, really, it's like their heart. If we hurt them, it's really hurt. So this is that's our government's policy doing that, focus in two things: precursor chemicals and also seizing their money. Okay, and I hope that we have 2 rounds, right? So I will give the floor to my colleagues, Khun Chik. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Khun Pais. Thank you so much. Very interesting. Assets and precursor. I think this is something that Inchik can talk a little bit about, this the idea of chemicals, precursor, this trade. I mean, with the shift that Jeremy and others have mentioned, what about this chemical, the way it traveled, the mobility of this new drug scourge? I mean, can you tell us a little bit about that, in this Southeast Asia context?
Hello everyone, my name is Inchik Shim. As a last speaker, sometimes it's quite hard to find different topics that these all 3 panelists already touched up on many different issues. But as Panu mentioned, I will focus a little bit on the precursor chemical issues. In order to make these synthetic drugs, for instance, methamphetamines, we need chemicals. And the most and best chemical to manufacture methamphetamine is either ephedrine or pseudoephedrine. That is why these chemicals were looked for by many syndicates. Either you are in Mexico or Myanmar or somewhere else. These are the most looking for chemicals. But these are really internationally controlled, and it's quite difficult to source them anymore. So in Myanmar, when you look at back, when Jeremy mentioned about 2014 and even prior to that, the main chemical that used for the manufacture of methamphetamine was the pseudoephedrine tablets. The tablet that contains the core tablets that containing pseudoephedrine. But nowadays, all these different types of chemicals are used for the manufacture of methamphetamines. Still, the major one is ephedrine and pseudoephedrine. Despite of this international control, national efforts, still these are the major chemical, because simply these chemicals can produce best methamphetamine. Followed by that is P2P and all these different precursor chemicals. Recently, a country in Mekong, they seized ethyl acetate, significant amount. So what I try to get here is that in the past, when there was, before the surge of mass manufacturers in the Golden Triangle area, chemicals were basically ephedrine or pseudoephedrine. These very simplified. I mean, there's only limited number of chemicals. But now, after the migration of the organized crime groups into the Golden Triangle area, they know how to use all these different chemicals. They're the one who understands the formulas of this chemical to manufacture methamphetamine. That's the big difference. Now, Myanmar authorities and Thailand authorities and all these other countries in China as well, they've been seizing all these different types of chemicals. And authorities in the regions contact us. We seize this one. What is this for? And we advise them, okay, this is for that kind of purposes. And I strongly advise that to ask this trader to come up with why you trade this particular chemical. So these countries in the region really need to understand that these organized crime groups, they are not the same people in the past who mainly rely on cold tablet that contain pseudoephedrines and using extractions and using the yaba for 100,000 pills. They bring tons of all these different chemicals to meet the demand and to engineer the expansion of the synthetic drug market in the region. And this is not only about methamphetamine. I think Jeremy mentioned that this is synthetics. There is other synthetic drugs. One is ketamine. It's been kind of a little bit overlooked because of the mass issue. But the ketamine is also manufactured in the Golden Triangle. I really doubt the armed groups in the Golden Triangle area, they understood how to use all these different chemicals to manufacture ketamine. These are organized crime groups, either who taught them how to do it, or they were there to manufacture this drug. So there has been a basically displacement of the major manufacturing site within these Mekong regions that has brought different types of chemicals and drugs traffic in and out of the Golden Triangle. I think I will leave it at here. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Inshik. Well, I mean, we're moving to the sort of the Q&A part of this panel discussion. So for all of you here, you can all go to the microphone right at the back, identify yourself, and ask the question, and tell us who you want to address. And also for those of you who are watching at home, this is our COVID-19 kind of. We have Facebook Live for our events now. You can always write your questions in the Facebook Live, and I'll try to keep an eye on it and can ask those questions for you. Marwan, can you? Yeah.
Hi, Marwan Mark of Nikkei Asian Review. Khun Paisi, thanks very much for your presentation. Most of you spoke about crime syndicates, and I'm just curious, we never mentioned the nationality of the crime syndicates. I'm just curious whether you're referring to Chinese crime syndicates, for one, and whether they have a presence in Thailand to move whatever is produced in the Golden Triangle into Malaysia, to markets in Australia, New Zealand, or even Japan.
I guess.
I can take a crack at it.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll take a little crack at that, Marwan, and then my good friend Paisith might want to add to it. You've touched on a very good point, which is to move the product from point A to point B, C, D, E, you need a network, and that requires a group that has the ability to transition across those points, those geographic points. And there are very few groups that can do that. When I started discussing at the beginning, I could elaborate this, but I do now using your example, I said that largely the trade was localized criminality in the past. And then we saw this evolution with the influx of organized crime into the Golden Triangle. That organized crime didn't just bring with them new product lines and the ability to produce very innovative or produce in innovative ways. They also brought with them their networks. So some of the groups that have migrated in there have themselves recently formed, and they formed out of a network of other groups. And what they have done is bring that to bear. So what they've done is they've shifted their production point in there. They then traffic to a variety of points across the countries you've described plus further afield, and they use their network to do so. I would say ethnically, and this is where it gets interesting. So yes, at the heart, at the core of these really big syndicates, you would say, okay, they're Cantonese, which I'm describing triads. But that's not the case for those recent groups. You have the Cantonese at the heart, at the core, because they would control it, they would finance it, they would run it. But what they do is they also have several other nationalities, Thais, Burmese, Vietnamese, and the networks that the Cantonese networks across the region. And these are globalized networks at this point. So what has occurred in the Golden Triangle has occurred because of this globalized capacity that they have to produce there, much like someone produces garments in Bangladesh or Cambodia and ship to their end market. And they have the network to do it, and they have the finance behind them to do it. They can pull together finance to pay that militia, like Patrick described, import the chemicals that Inchik described, and to ship logistically to Australia if they have to. And they run ships on the ocean to do it. I mean, these guys are big. So it is not your mom and pop shop guy with the little pill press and blah, blah, blah. No. Not those guys. So ethnically, number of different nationalities. But using the region for what it is, which is for them a risk board of different opportunity across that risk board. So I don't know if there's more to add on that, but maybe Khun Paisith has something. I know you do. But can you? I don't know.
Right. The drug syndicates, and as Khun Jeremy said, that there are many nationalities. But the most that we found recently from our operations or from our intelligence is that we found quite a few of Chinese syndicate. They're linked or they involved with the drug smugglings and also involved with the drugs producing as well. Because of, I think, because of their nature, because they have a good connections, so they can really link to different parts. Say they want to move some drugs to one country to another countries, they have connections. They know the rule, sort of that. So the Chinese syndicate is quite a big syndicate, and then a big problem for us. Some of them live in Thailand or live in our neighboring countries. They may look like legitimate business, but underneath they work on the dark side, involved with the drugs. This is our work. As I mentioned at the beginning, that we hurt them. If we don't have enough evidence to arrest them yet, we try to cut off their assets or their money, because those syndicates, they only care about assets, about money, about profit. So we hurt them on that. But once we have enough evidence, we arrest them. We will put them in jails. But again, these people, they not usually touch the drug. They're not the one who really, carry the drugs to sell it or to distribute it. They sit on top. So in order to arrest them, we need to get enough evidence. One of those is money transactions. We need to do a lot of money transactions to prove that they link with the other groups, ethnic groups, some Thai that involved. We check with their telephone use. All right, we check with their social media use. They use Line, WhatsApps, emails. We have to detect them. We are in the process of getting new equipment to be able to trace down those, through the social media platform. Because without the new technologies, it's very hard to really find any evidence. It's very hard. So that is something that we are working on with the assistance from our colleagues, UNODC, our agency, international agency, our colleagues from United States, UK, Australia. Yeah, we're working on that. In terms of the sharing informations, joint operations, and conducting the training and supporting new technologies and new equipments. So this is ONCB working with our colleagues in order to be able to cope with those syndicates. We hope to be in front of them, but very difficult. Just to be able to cope them, just on par with them. I think that's our goal right now. So thank you.
Tony?
Yeah, Tony Davis from the Jane's Defence Group. I guess this question is primarily for Jeremy and also Khun Sa, but also I think to the other two panelists. We've heard a lot about the Golden Triangle, and it sort of still comes across as this huge dark area which nobody really understands, which clearly is not the case. I think it was useful the way that Patrick divided it between those groups which are fighting for autonomy and those groups which are militias. But going beyond that, my question is this: to what extent does the international community have good intelligence on what is being produced where? Now, I know that scientifically speaking, the ONCB does a great job in analyzing yaba tablets for one thing, maybe ice as well, and being able to tell, okay, this tablet comes from a certain area or even a certain factory. So is there a lot that you gentlemen cannot tell us about what you know in terms of what is being produced where? Thank you.
You want to go first, Patrick?
No, Tony probably knows more about this than I do. He doesn't need my answer.
Maybe I'll just say a few words, and then my colleagues can jump in, especially Paisa and would have something to add on this. So, yeah, we do know a fair bit, but you've touched on a couple of points here, and Patrick touched on a very good point at the beginning, the division between those. He divided nicely those two types of groups that are very active in a place like Shan. What he described and what I alluded to, as did the DSG, is the governance challenge of Shan State. I mean, in very broad terms, they have governance challenges. They have some pretty severe ones, frankly. We do have a good sense, and I commend ONCB for they do have really good intelligence on some of the routes within Shan, which very clearly lead back to certain geographic points. But then it comes back to the other point that I alluded to and Patrick talked about, which is the control of that territory. This is where I might diverge a little bit. We know that there are non-militia groups with equal capacity happening. There's a territory there that is not under the control of BGFs or the people's militias, but under the control of some of the signatory groups, in fact, where there are definite routes leading back into those territories, which are mapped out extremely clearly, and you can trace it through where there are seizures through the teabag tracing and to the shipments that are made, the seizures that are made here and in other countries, they clearly go back to certain points. But then it comes to the other issue is how do you get in there to address a situation like that? And that's a very big conversation that needs to happen with the government of Myanmar. We have tried to engineer the beginnings of that conversation through some analysis around the illicit economy of that country and the beneficiaries of that illicit economy and how does one move away from it over time. You can't deal with such entrenched interests easily. You're not going to police your way out of this. There's a political solution that has to be in place, and incentives have to be in place for people to be able to move away from the size of the economy and money flows that I've described earlier. So, but again, there is a lot of information flowing on the geographic points of production that is understood. But again, that larger political issue hangs over the whole discussion, and it isn't taking place, frankly speaking. And the solution is not solely within that country either. The neighboring states have to be a part of that political solution because the description of the business is now regional. And the people controlling it are not within the geographic territory. They don't even go there. They have no interest in going there. They just use it for what it is, a really good place to produce drugs. So they're using it for what it is. And I think the other thing that Inshik touched on, which is very important in this, and you've touched on it, Tony, is the issue of understanding the composition of the drugs, which is a bit of a diversion from the political, but the issue of precursors is very vital. The talent that has been imported into that state from outside to produce the drugs is incredible. They have the best chemists in the world living there now that are producing using a whole plethora of precursor chemicals and pre-precursors. They're manufacturing precursors, for goodness sakes. So they've got talent in there which is really good, and they're able to, if they can't get chemical A, they use chemical B. They can't use D, they get C, D, E. So there's another issue there, which is we have to arrest or deal with this regional chemical and pharmaceutical industry component, which is contributing. For every ton of drugs that comes out, many tons of chemicals go in. And we estimate minimum 300 tons of crystal, say, come out. Well, that's thousands of tons of chemicals pouring in there. The volume of chemicals going in, you're talking freight train loads per year. So that trade has to be dealt with. No chemicals, no drugs, like the DSG said. But that's a very different solution than a policing solution. You're dealing with industry, you're dealing with the contributors to that. So we have to make that had to make that difficult for them. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Khun Jeremy, because you already mentioned about the political already. Because I'm not going to talk about politicals, even though it's an international political. But I will talk about the really law enforcement works. The ONCB, we have the officer stationed in 5 countries, namely Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and China. That's why we have informations, because we work with the local officer in those countries. Me, myself, I've been to Myanmar 6-7 times, 6-7 cities, because I used to work on the anti-human trafficking before, when I was at the Department of Special Investigation, or DSI. So I went to Myanmar, work with the authorities. But I really want to go to those sites, production site, which you just mentioned, in Golden Triangle. This is where I want to go, really. And I almost gone to those sites, because about 4 months ago in March, Myanmar authorities make a lot of big raids on the production site, drug production site in area called Golden Triangles. And Myanmar authority, Myanmar police talk to us, and then they need assistance because in ONCB we have the division called technicals research, which is laboratory, that we can look at those drugs. We seize what type of the drugs, what packagings, what are the ingredients. This is how it works, because once we know that, we know where the drug comes from. So we were going to send our officer, which I volunteered to lead the team to Myanmar to check on those the drug seizes, because I like to see the factory with my own eyes. But because of the COVID-19, at that time, we were not be able to fly to Myanmar. And the Myanmar said, okay, we probably have to hang on. So now 4 months already. So I'm still looking forward to really go to Myanmar and to really, if possible, to really check on those sites, the factory, in what area. But it's not easy because it's very dangerous. Even Myanmar authority, sometimes they are not be able to go in that area because of the, as you mentioned, because of the ethnic armed groups stationed there. So they have to be very careful on that. So I don't know whether I'm lucky not be able to go there or I'm not lucky. Okay.
Well, Khun Sa, if you want media to come along to the meth lab, I'll give you my number. I would love to go too. I have just an adjacent thought, and that's that when you're talking about groups that control land where drugs are produced, I feel like you want to think about who can you negotiate with and who can you talk to, who can you have a conversation with. If you're talking with the head of a triad group that Jeremy mentioned, you can't talk to them at all. There's nothing that you can say to them. If you're talking about one of these army-backed militias, there's not much to talk about with them. They don't necessarily have strong political goals, and they certainly don't want to be sitting down in a meeting with you with cameras popping. The indigenous armed groups who may or may not have production facilities producing drugs on their territory, there is something you can talk about with them. There is something you can offer them. Recognition, dignity, they like to be accepted. They like to be seen side by side with international organizations or government figures because it gives legitimacy to their group. There are certain things they want that have nothing to do with drugs. And so you can actually have a conversation with them, and in some face-saving way, they're not going to say, okay, now we'll go shut down the meth lab. You can offer them certain things or certain levels of cooperation, and then very silently they may be more inclined to make sure the meth lab is shut down because they have other political goals that they're looking to satisfy. So that's just a stray thought.
Any more questions? Oh, Gwen?
Hi, Gwen Robinson, President of the Foreign Correspondents Club and Nikkei Asian Review. So thank you to all the panelists for very fascinating insights into the increase in trafficking and production in the region. What wasn't clear was, what is clear is that law enforcement and efforts to curb it are not keeping pace, obviously. So the solutions are not at the moment adequate even to curb the massive increase, or what seems to be an increase. So I'd be interested, I think, Jeremy, you hinted that or suggested there are, new ideas under discussion for perhaps new or more effective methods to curb the production and trade And one suggestion is possibly some more monitoring of legal or legitimate chemicals used in the... But is there any sort of thought about action plans or new initiatives that are cross-border and also concern the businesses that produce chemicals that form the basis of some of these drugs? That could be a question to Khun Paisit, Jeremy, or...
Regulating the chemicals, yeah. We want to take Chief first?
Okay, thank you for the questions. I absolutely agree that we need to work more on the precursor chemical control. I will give you an example that I kind of often mention whenever I have this kind of a chance. We see almost every day the headlines that start with a record amount of methamphetamine seizures, but we don't see record amount of chemical seizures because simply they don't really look for that. And Jeremy also mentioned that, you know, in order to produce, let's say, 1 ton of methamphetamine, you need around 1.5 tons of ephedrine or pseudoephedrines, right? And this region, last year, they seized 140 tons of methamphetamines. This is only seizures. Let's say this is only represent like 5 or 10%. Then how much of all these different chemicals were trafficked? That we don't seize them that much. Quite little, small amount of the chemical was seized. We have a problem, one here, that the chemical has not been really prioritized, the seizure of chemical. And second is, this region has been experiencing the rapid growth of the chemical industry. It's in addition to China and India. It's about the risk regions. Thailand is a good example. Vietnam, Indonesia, they are all now putting one of their, like, the industry they're really pouring money into is chemical industry. On the other hand, the regulatory matters a lot. Despite of these increases in the chemical outputs, whether they have a proper regulatory system, that's something that can be discussed further, because there are many different agencies involved in general. When you really regulate chemicals, there are FDA, Food and Drug Administration, Customs, Police, Ministry of Industries and Commerce. They have all the distinctive roles in terms of monitoring and regulating chemicals. But in some of the countries, they have problems of national coordination among all these different ministries and agencies. So when they can really coordinate each other and regulate and monitor these dangerous chemicals, then there is a really big problem for the regional corporations. It is quite difficult for us to expect this country will have a system to monitor all these different chemicals. So that is why UNODC and also ONCB, we are really working hard on building on the regulatory mechanisms for those countries. And this is a really good start that we have this report that will come out on looking at the loopholes of a regulatory mechanism in the countries, in the regions, in several countries in the region. Several recent cases of the precursor chemicals were really enlightening for us and other international community, because we were able to see there are many different loopholes that should be and must be addressed. Otherwise, the drug business will continue as usual.
If I could just add a point on that. It then becomes political, because the industry is so big, the bigger it has become, the more powerful it has become. And largely the industry is operated in a very regulation-light fashion, self-regulating. And of course, they're in the business of sales like every other business. So the volumes of chemicals that are moving, there's an incentive to keep those moving. So that has been a big challenge for the region that they're now grappling with. And it's not like they struggle to coordinate internally within a government as sophisticated as the one here or in Vietnam. But then you also have the issue of countries exporting to other countries, and countries don't even know they're doing it. They're just shipping. So you end up with stuff just flowing really fast. You also have the issue in Myanmar where you have imports that go disguised, essentially, and they go into places which operate separately from the state. So you have the challenge of those separate entities within the country essentially having to have a role almost in a way, and they can't because they're not a country. So you end up having special region territories or territories in border areas which are highly vulnerable to this chemical trade. Some of the chemicals that he has described are as valuable as the drugs themselves. That's how much they're worth. So you have this huge volume of them flowing and lots of money being made and then laundered. But there's another issue, Gwen, that you touched on, which so that's an element that needs to be dealt with, which is the chemical trade. But then, yes, the states do politically meet and share an action plan. Thailand hosted ministers last November, Interior Ministers, Justice Minister of Thailand, to negotiate a new plan of action which rolls for 2 years, where they basically agree on cross-border cooperation elements, border security, and so on and so forth. We're a party to that, and we help spur that along. But I think that when you think about the magnitude of the challenge, it can't simply be isolated to ministries of interior. There's a huge diplomatic element to this. There's a very, very big economic element to this, and it has to be elevated on the political landscape in this region, because the money that I described earlier, it exceeds the GDP of several countries in the Mekong subregion vastly. So you have scales of money being generated that are, billions of dollars. And now, at the wholesale value, it's say several billion or many billions that are made by some of the groups. But again, that might exceed the GDP of Laos. That's ridiculous. So they're more powerful than the political forces that are against them. And as I said earlier, they use the region like a chessboard. They use the special economic zones very effectively. They use the fact that there's governance failure of one type in one state, another type in another state, and another type in another state, and they basically use all of them. It's like they move their operation as they need to suit their purposes. We have to raise this politically and make their life uncomfortable in multiple jurisdictions at one time. And that has really become much more important since this has moved from a localized crime, the Khun Sa days and the pill press days, to the more regional globalized crime. You cannot operate in isolation anymore, and yet the systems of the countries are often quite isolated. They're not able to do what I'm describing. And on the back of that, the growth. So.
Sir?
Hi, I'm Oliver from Thailand Business News. So first, I want to thank you about giving us all these details about the dark trade. It sounds like a regular business to me. No, you just import the materials, you produce, you export, you sell, everything normal. Except what I don't understand is how far you have a lot of experience, details on the production, but when it comes to the output, the money which is openly discussed in the business, I heard very little. I heard of figures like $60 billion and something about Macau and the casino. So my question actually is very naive: where is the money?
Good question.
Not in my account, or I wouldn't be sitting here. But the 60 billion is across the value chain. So you don't have that. Say the guy who owns the factory is making billions, but across the chain, the money is generated and laundered. But it is a very large amount of money. The biggest, of course, in the hands of the kingpins that Khun Sa described. And so we do know where some of that money goes, and I commend Thailand for shifting the legal approach to go after undeclared or assets that can't be understood, I guess you could call it, unexplained wealth. Suspicious wealth. So basically, explain how you have $100 million or we're going to take it. That logic. That's a good move. And that's a brilliant move, in fact. We would encourage other states to do it as well. But the money is not in Myanmar. The money goes in there, but the money is actually generated and spent outside. Just like, as I said earlier, the garment trade with Bangladesh or Cambodia. You don't usually see the profits going into those countries. But the payments go in to the supplier, to the militia. I don't know if there's other comments. Patrick might have some on the economics.
I would just say that if you're picturing some Khun Sa like warlord in the jungle, these are people, and I think Khun Paisit alluded to this as well. The people that would be towards the top of these organized crime hierarchies, you really would not know that they were involved in that sort of business, and they would have children going to international school in Singapore, London. Their kids, let's just talk about, because I know more about the indigenous groups. They may have kids who don't even speak the indigenous language that they're from, because they've spent all their time in London. So they are just extraordinarily wealthy people. As far as where all of their money goes, I'm not sure either. I mean, I've heard other experts talk about when you're trying to park that much money somewhere, a lot of them look to real estate. I think that is quite popular. In Myanmar, if they're operating in Myanmar, and the big ones are operating more regionally, but in Myanmar, there's not many great places to put your money. A lot of people are not confident in the banking system, so they don't want to park a bunch of money in a bank, and so then you would look to buying a condo or condo building or something more secure. But I think this is all quite mysterious. I don't think there's anyone on the planet that knows exactly where all the money is parked in this, in just the meth trade.
What about the casinos in Cambodia, for instance? Is this a good place to put money once you have earned it?
It's a good place to legitimize money quickly, because once you put it in, you can have it shuffle through the casino and it suddenly becomes washed. So that's a phenomenon, and I would point out what I said earlier about the special economic zones and the casinos. A lot of money goes into those zones, and then it's very quickly legitimized. And it's quite phenomenal, apparently, how much money flows through some of them, even though there's very few patrons that actually enter them. For example, there's casinos that I've been, King's Romans or Paradise across the river, don't seem to have a lot of people in them, but yet there's a lot of cash flow through them. Very interesting phenomenon. So I think that's an issue which the region really needs to grapple with, is the legitimization of cash through these businesses, and how that is then facilitated through state banking systems, which is exactly what happens. That's a foreign currency zone I've described. Foreign currencies are spent in there, legitimized through the banking system, and then it's out and wire transferred to big banking centers in this region, and we both know there's only two, so it goes to them. And that's facilitated by an actual country, by their state banking system. And that's a great concern to us and to Thailand, I know.
Thanks, Panu. Thank you, panel. That was absolutely brilliant. Really enjoyed that tonight, and I learned a lot. But of all the things that, my name's Jonathan Miller, I'm with Channel 4 News. Of all the things I learned tonight, it's something that you, Jeremy, said not long ago. They've got the best chemists in the world. They are manufacturing precursors now. Now, about 10 years ago, I remember doing a story in West Africa about how drugs were being flown across from Brazil that had come out of Mexico. This was cocaine out of Mexico through Brazil, crossing the Atlantic in little Cessnas and landing in Guinea-Bissau. And on the way back, they were taking pseudoephedrine to make crystal meth in Mexico for the US market. It was a brilliant round trip. It was profitable. And even the Mexican cartels hadn't got their heads around producing pseudoephedrine. That surely makes it absolutely impossible for it to be stopped if these brilliant chemists are actually producing the necessary precursor chemicals in situ, in Wa territory, in Shan State, wherever, inside. How can you ever stop this if that's happening now?
Who's going
That stumped you.
Good question.
And she got a short draw.
I think it is. You're right. The Mexican cartels, when there was a control on the pseudoephedrine, instead of they trying to find a way to manufacture pseudoephedrine, they use different chemicals, which produce a little bit inferior mass than using pseudoephedrines. Later, they figured it out how to make it better with this chemical called P2P. So they are now making good meth as well. But back to the point, in Myanmar, yes, they are very genius. They are looking for, if there is a control on pseudoephedrine, they are not only looking for alternative for like P2P, they are looking for the other chemicals to manufacture pseudoephedrines. So they've been doing that really well, and we should not really forget about who the manufacturers are. So they were producing methamphetamine in Guangdong in China, and they're the same group of people who already mastered how to use all these chemicals, and they simply changed the location of manufacturing of synthetic drugs. So they already had every formula in their head. So they were able to just use this formula where these chemicals were not under the control. In Myanmar, they recently control several chemicals, but back in the days, all these chemicals are not under the national control, unlike China. So there was a big difference. But again, the same group of people who already mastered how to use all these chemicals. So what we need to do, international scheduling system is actually quite slow. Although UNODC, is a body to every year that discuss with all the member states that, okay, certain chemical needs to be scheduled. However, this is very, very lengthy process and is quite slow. So what we normally do is we advise member states, okay, we see all these different types of chemicals. There are certain, these are really dangerous, and it's very likely that these chemicals are used for the manufacture of drugs. You might want to schedule it, right? And you need to, I think, in terms of fighting against illicit drugs or addressing illicit drugs, you need to have some foresight. We had when the Chinese started to cracking down on this Guangdong drug syndicate, to be honest, we were not able to see they will move to Myanmar, but they did. But now it's happening on the Myanmar is squeezing it, and now the Chinese have been trying to cut down all these chemicals to Myanmar. Thailand is working really do all this best to seize all these drugs along the border with Myanmar. What will happen to us will be probably simply another displacement from Myanmar to another country within the Mekong. It's very likely. Same for chemicals. When we try to control all these chemicals, they can go a step further. So we need to really expect and monitor other chemicals to be exploited by traffickers.
I would add on that point about the what you described and the manufacturer in the country. We don't know where that is taking place, or we cannot prove it 100%, but we're pretty sure. And the way we are pretty sure is because we see the intelligence on the drugs that are seized. And we have very good intelligence from our Thai colleagues explaining the composition of the crystal meth, that it goes into certain strains of certain kinds of tea bags that find their way around the region. And certain strains have 100% composition of a certain precursor chemical which is never seized, indicating that either there's a massive diversion problem from industry within neighboring states, or they're manufacturing the precursor themselves. And given what we're seeing in the country in terms of precursors, it's pretty sure that they're making it, because the volumes are too big. So there's no way they could source that much precursor, but they could make it, and they have the talent to do it, and there's other chemicals they can use to do it. So the forensic intelligence pretty much indicates that. It's just a matter of actually mapping it out, and finding out where. But there's we think probably a couple of significant facilities in there that are doing that, and again with that talent that they've imported into the country.
Just one point about the big picture. Why do countries like India, and namely China, have these giant chemical producing industries? It's because they're primarily it's an export industry. They're making stuff that ends up on the shelf in Europe and America and inside China and comes to Thailand and everything. So these chemical industries are so big because of globalization. I don't know much about precursors. I try to educate myself as best I can, but at one point did a deep dive, and it seemed like certain precursors that can go into the process can also be used. Obviously, pseudoephedrine is for cold medicine, but also some stuff has so many different uses. Like it can go into ketchup, it can go into bug spray, and as Inshik, actually correct me if I'm wrong, as you start to schedule these precursors, which basically means to control them or regulate them, you can make it more annoying for the chemists because they have to go farther down the chain. And it's like, all right, I need 2 of these to make 1 of these, to make 1 of these, and then I combine it. Okay, finally, I've got the chemical I need. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah. That's how scheduling works.
Can I just follow up on that point? I mean, with the precursors and pseudoephedrine in particular, given the fact that it is a legitimate import as a cold medicine, again, how do you stop it? How can you stop legitimate imports of a drug like that?
Well, there is no legitimate import to Myanmar. It's completely banned. You can't even get it as a controlled substance. So you
don't want to get a cold in Myanmar?
No, you don't. You don't want to sniffle in Myanmar. Definitely not COVID. But they don't allow that import at all. But again, as I said earlier, there's control issues of the territory and other border regions where things just seemingly flow across. But the precursors, there's 2 elements of control at the international level. One is the controls, the scheduling, which Patrick described, basically, which can cause this cascade effect. But there's another effort which the international community has put in place, largely as a result of synthetic opioids. But there's there's a special surveillance list which was announced a few years ago of chemicals, like essentially designer precursors, which are now floating around the world. And that is actually that effort has had a bit of impact because it's impacted the Mexicans, it's impacted here in this region as well. Less so here. And actually that's a very good point. I was just having a bit of a brain issue here, but there's a huge difference between organized crime in this region and organized crime in Latin America. And that is the chemical industry access. The Mexicans have to import from where? From here. They typically, some of the organized crime groups in this region actually have in the past supplied them with precursors. COVID slowed down, you might have read, precursor shipments into Mexico, which caused problems for the North American drug market. That didn't occur here. We've seen the flow more or less steady. It has changed trafficking patterns, and it has had probably a distracting effect on law enforcement for a couple of months. When the seizures dropped, we don't think the supply dropped, but the seizures dropped. Because they were busy, COVID, at the border. But the issue being that the organized crime groups here have direct industry access, and they've had it for decades because they have relationships that people in other parts of the world, the Europeans, the Mexicans, the Colombians, simply don't have. So because they are present on the ground, and the biggest chemical producing regions of the world are places where those triads come from. So they work with industry. They're like a partner in a sense. So we have to also deal with that issue. It's a huge, huge challenge.
Thank you. I'm Sally Thompson with the Border Consortium. Thank you to all the panelists. I'd like to bring the discussion back to money laundering. And we focused on, you very much said the focus is northern Myanmar, northern Shan state, as where the manufacturing is happening. And you're isolating it to the north. And yet, when we look at the money laundering, you talked about Sihanoukville, you talked about the casinos happening in Cambodia. You look at what's happening along the Myanmar-Thailand border, and we're seeing the expansion of casinos coming from the north, coming down to the south. We're seeing what's happening in opposite Mersot, Shwe Ko Ko, that huge development that's happening there, down in Kanchanaburi that was mentioned. We're seeing casinos being established there. I guess my questions are sort of twofold, really to Thailand. What are you going to do about this? Here we are looking at organized crime, which you had basically parceled conveniently in the north of Myanmar. We're looking at now it really coming right the way down the border areas with Thailand, all the way down the south. We've seen the ceasefire agreements in Myanmar opening up trade, opening up the general movement flows of people, trade in border areas. Are we looking at much more increased organized crime in neighboring Myanmar? And what does that mean for Thailand in terms of what's happening in the border areas and the trade in the border areas? And what can be done and what action are you taking? And who else can be involved in this aside from whether it's looking at the drugs, but looking at trade and bringing in much broader sector of operations, so that it's not just sort of monolithic looking at the drugs control, but actually the much broader economy that's happening in these border areas and in the region. Thank you.
Khun Sa, you want to take a stab at the Thai? Right.
Very, very difficult questions because it's very hard for me to understand. But anyway, I try my best. As I mentioned earlier, that there's a drug trade, okay, drug smuggling along the borders. Thai governments with our counterpart will do we call the border control, checking along the border, trying to stop the drug smuggling into Thailand. We not just standing there and then just check the bag or the lorry or the trucks, but we exchange intelligence informations. So most of the time, we manage to intercept the drug because of intelligence. Sometimes we will not arrest them or stop them at the border. We let them go in. We call control delivery. Once they get into some places, then we arrest and trying to get to the mastermind. That's about the drugs. Okay, ma'am. For the money launderings also another problems, which is very serious problems. The money being transferred, right, from one account to one account easily, very, very difficult. Because for us, in order to freeze the bank account of anyone's, you need to prove to a certain level that he or she involving with the illegal businesses or narcotics or drugs. So that's difficult to do that. Another thing is the syndicate. What they do now, they do the money laundering techniques. They're using money laundering techniques. Either going through the casino along the borders, okay, money in and they get money from the casino and then they can show it to their authority that, oh, okay, this is the money that I earned from that casino, 10 million bahts or 10 million judge or whatever. That is one thing. Another thing is now they're using the gold shop. They have money, they buy gold from Thailand and then send it to the other side for sale. And then they get the money and then the money become legitimate because they sell gold. So this is something that we work on, trying to stop money being moved over to another countries. Again, once the money transferred to the another account, especially overseas, that's a problem occur because we cannot just go alone to intercept or to investigate. We need the cooperation from our colleagues, allies. That's why we have MOU with our neighboring countries and our ally on the money laundering side, on the narcotic side as well. So this is something that we're working on. Okay, ma'am. And another thing that I like to tell you about the situation that maybe nothing to do with your question, but it's something that I like to share with you, that we found a lot of drug trades, selling drugs through online, social media, a lot. They're using Twitter, using Facebook, using Line to order or to sell, to offer the drugs. We found a lot, especially during the COVID pandemics. They changed their techniques. Once they order the drugs online, the drug being shipped by sending through the postal or courier, private and the public ones. This is become a problem now for Thailand, especially at a street level. They're doing that. So what we do now that we are encourage the company, the transportation, the company, the postal company services to really be aware of these matters. Recently, we conducted training for them to watch out those suspicious person and also the people. So there's something that it's become more problem for us now, especially after the COVID, and it's going on. So we work with those companies on that to be able to stop the selling the drugs online. Okay.
Jeremy?
Can I ask a follow-up question, Khun Paisit? If someone sends drugs across town on a grab bike or something like that, will the guy driving the grab bike be charged, or will your police do the work to figure out who is sending it and who is receiving it? Because I haven't seen this case in the news yet, but that case is certainly coming because, so I've heard that these courier services are used to move things around.
It depends. Mostly we have the tips. We do investigations in advance. Okay? It may happen because of the arrest before, and then we have the intelligence that these services being used for sending those drugs. So we watch using CCTV, using a lot of technique. We try to prove or to be able to identify that whether those, the clubs involved or not. We can tell. I mean, if they're just there, just being used, we can tell that. But if they do it for more than once or twice, then we are suspecting that they know what they are deliver. And recently we be able to arrest the officer, no, not the officer, the guy who work in the company. That they know they work with the drug syndicate, and they got paid for that, and then they deliver. They do it many times until we sure that they know that they're involved, and then we make arrests. So these need kind of investigations. We just not just if we found that it's very difficult that you just go then you open the box and find the drugs. It's something that have to be worked on that beforehand. Okay, thank you.
Jeremy, I think you say something.
Yeah, the question was about one of the preliminary parts of that question was about the money and the casinos at the border areas, and I just want to point out something about the experience we're seeing in the region as the crime has regionalized, globalized, whatever you want to call it. The money flows have regionalized and globalized as well, and that requires a very different response than it used to. And it's only really in the West, so for example, the United States or Canada where I'm from or Australia, where they were really looking at the related crimes to drug trafficking themselves only quite recently, and connecting the dots between different types of crimes using different departments of the government, and then mushrooming out an investigation to seize assets and so forth. Now, certain parts of the world are much more advanced than this part of the world at doing that. But Thailand is kind of within this region a bit of a leader in that. So Thailand is leading the way by doing this unexplained wealth seizures and so forth, and looking at cash couriers and trade-based money laundering, the use of gold as a method of shifting resources and so forth, gemstones. So they're doing that, but very few countries are, to be quite frank. So we have, behind the scenes, we've been observing the countries and working closely with them through this MOU that Paiseth referred to, where the ministers got together last November, and we actually did a precursor study, not about precursor, but a study to set the stage for the states to take collective action on what we have been observing, which is the use of the casinos in border areas, and to trigger a policy change of the nature that we think is necessary, i.e. you get country state banks to start looking at the flows through their systems into the banks rather than just look at the individual transactions in their banks. Is to do that, you really need to convince ministers, you need to convince prime ministers that this is something which is worth their while. So we're now looking, we got the ministers to agree to a deep dive on casinos and money laundering at that ministerial negotiation. And so it'll take us quite a while, but we're going to do that, and it's going to look at the money flows within the sub-region and how they're cascading across the countries, particularly in the border areas. And I point out, Paiseth and I went in January. He came with us to Kanchanaburi. We observed one of the casinos on the other side of the border, which is just near Kanchanaburi, being constructed right now. And you can see the potential for these things because they're big physical facilities. But again, they don't necessarily be full of people to move cash. The other thing that is occurring is technology is changing this. And I'm not going to the line argument, but the online gambling is quite big in this region. So we saw a migration out of Sihanoukville recently into other parts of this region. You touched on Shui Koko. Migration of operators from one jurisdiction to another very quickly because there's pressures placed in one on the other, but the technology allows for that seamless transition. The casino can essentially seamlessly move from one place to another. So we have to also somehow get states to look at the capacities in countries in these border areas for their IT infrastructure, which is now apparently quite significant. That's a big issue which we're also talking to them about. But again, I'm describing, what am I describing? Governance issues which involve not simply drug authorities and police, financial authorities, IT, and so on and so forth. It's very complex. But I do commend Thailand for helping shepherd that discussion through and taking the initial first steps and indicating to their neighbors that they're going to be looking at the cash flows at the borders, and that's a very, very, very good move that we're trying to get the other countries to do as well.
One last point on the subject of casinos. These casino special economic zones, in addition to the money laundering aspect, these places are also good places to store things that are illegal en route to other places. They're good places to meet and have meetings with people, as traffickers have to sit down and have tea and hash things out as well. They're also really good places to host online businesses that are not on the up and up, that may rely on extortion or all sorts of things that you couldn't just do here in Bangkok. So they really serve as a hub for lots of interesting things.
You go there often?
Yeah, I've been to King's Roman, and I had the same observation. There was no one playing. I like to play blackjack. It was just a bunch of empty baccarat tables. I don't know how they're reporting so much income. It was a bit sleepy. Well, the casino was.
Yeah, hi, Philip Sherwell from the Sunday Times. Thank you all for a great presentation on a truly daunting challenge. I'm going to ask you, Patrick, as you are unencumbered by a title or a series of letters of the alphabet after your name. If you could wave your magic wand from the experiences you have and the research you've done and the digging you've done, and sort of suggest a couple of things that maybe your colleagues on the panel wouldn't be able to suggest to challenge these situations, so I'd be interested to hear them.
Sure. Wow. Did you bring the wand, or? The first thing is I would just reinforce what I said in the beginning. There are certain groups, indigenous armed groups with political agendas that I think you can meet and have serious discussions with, and I'll go back to the WA. When you see that they actually have tried to make that shift more times in their history than people realize, they never get incentivized for it, or they always get slapped down. So I think it's quite extraordinary. It makes you sound like a naive Pollyanna to give them any credit for anything. They wiped out their... I brought the map.
Oh, really?
I realize no one can see this, but this is from the UNODC. This is a map of where poppies are grown. So the two areas that I just circled in red are areas where there are virtually no poppies grown or very few poppies grown. If you go back all the way centuries back, this was an area where like primo grade A poppies were grown. It's an extraordinarily great place to grow poppies, and extraordinarily bad place to grow everything else, like food, rice, and corn. It's really hard to just eke out a living there. So when groups like that do want to engage with them, you're going to get a lot of flack. Myanmar's not going to like it because you're treating them like a government. Human rights groups aren't going to like it because these groups may do all sorts of other things. But it's just one thing that you could try. Obviously, the drug war as it's being waged isn't working. And the other point I would just make is, and this is the part where I also sound a bit radical, but decriminalization, at least for drug users, I think would go a really long way in just having a better society. As crazy as that sounds, I'll quote Khun Paibun Kumchaya. So he was the former Minister of Justice. He's now on the Privy Council, meaning he's advising the palace. And I pray to God that I do not misquote him because, but anyway, he said we have to learn to live with drugs like a man with cancer is trying to live a happy life with this disorder. And so if anyone has an alternative or a way that we can win the war on drugs after 50 years, there's the microphone. But I haven't really heard one, and I think that the public has really lost faith in the idea of wiping out drugs from society. I think maybe the first step that might actually we're starting to get to a point where this might be politically palatable, would be just not to throw people in prison for drug possession. And maybe don't go so hard on people who are selling small amounts. I don't sit around and worry about the fates of men and women who make millions or billions of dollars from this trade, just like I don't sit around and worry about how CEOs are doing. But I do sit around and worry about how fairly everyday people are treated by this, because I know it's taboo. There are people in this room that have done drugs harder than marijuana. I don't happen to think that anyone in this room belongs in a cage for that. We know that it disproportionately affects people who can't wriggle their way out of a police situation. That's true not just in Thailand, but in the United States. So there seems to be some room at high levels of the Thai establishment for some openness to this idea. And Thailand, like my country, the United States, has a real reckoning to deal with, because, as I said, the prisons are full and it creates a lot of ripple effects in society.
If I can add on that, your 2 points are not really that different than what we would espouse. I think, and I think it's important what Patrick just said. The decriminalization is a good first step. It would go a long way. We can't imagine a regulated drug market. Quite frankly, it would not work, especially for synthetics, like, i.e., say some of them kill, and that's not something which you can prescribe. Fentanyl and crystal meth and all these things, they can't be regulated. That's not feasible. But you can decriminalize. Harm reduction is crucial. Helping people to deal with the potential damage they can do to themselves is very, very important step to take. And I think that's something which I'm glad you quoted Paibun. I know him well. We met recently to talk about this and prison overcrowding, and we're going to do some work with the country on drug policy reforms in that space. But I think, and there is an openness in the ONCB, there's an openness in the Ministry of Justice to doing these things. changing bureaucratic norms is hugely difficult because it takes years to shift the focus of a bureaucracy away from one approach to another. So you need champions like him, and you need, or the SG and others that are willing to have that discussion. So that's a very important point he made, and I think, and that's something which we really deserves discussion in this region. We need champions, whether it's Thailand or any other country. We need countries to champion this cause now, because this region has a very one-sided approach, and it's clearly not worked. Prisons are full. Okay, we all get it. Drug problem worse than ever before. Yep. So what are we going to do? And I think we have to look at that side of the equation. And I think the other point you made about conversations with the ethnic armed groups, I totally agree, actually. We were part of the WA exiting the opium business. Sadly, a lot of yaba was produced in the same territories, but as you said, they don't speak with one voice. There are people in the WA that want to be legitimized. They themselves have internal crackdowns from time to time to push out some that are involved, but they are but one entity and one special region or couple within the Shan. There are other groups. One of the starting points needs to be a candid discussion. You can't incentivize people without explaining the situation and tabling candid data. One of the things that Myanmar needs to do, and we would be happy to support and consider part of the dialogue. I mean, we deal with our CSS and some of the others, but in the peace talks, they have to talk about the sources of income and the money flows, and they don't. They've all signed on to say they'll not be in the drug business. That's in the agreement that they all sign as part of this, as I understand it. But we all know that they're taxing it, involved in it, or whatnot. And so there's a lot of duplicity in there. But one of the things that could happen is really good, a starting point for pushing the political envelope, and solutions would be data, candid discussion in the middle, but they never quite seem to get there. We'd be happy to contribute to that beyond our one-on-one conversations with the groups, but it's really a huge challenge.
The UNODC had a presence, actual officials in WA State in the early 2000s, as I understand. That's actually quite a great success story. And again, when you repeat it or say anything good about it, I feel like because the narrative is so entrenched, it makes you sound like I said, like you're naive. Oh, don't you know that they just that it was just a BS or as a cover for this and that and the third. I mean, if you never incentivize or reward groups like this for doing something big and massive, why should they not go back to doing what they were doing before?
I think, last question, I guess.
Oh goodness, if it's the last question, maybe someone else should go.
No, please.
It might be pretty bad. Sorry, Patrick, going to take you up on your offer. My name is Shane, Bangkok resident and hotelier, of talking a little bit about the comparisons between here in SEA and LATAM and what that sort of looks like. Big picture, small picture. And do you feel, I mean, Latin America has been quite sensationalized recent years with some big TV shows. We've all grabbed a Spanish phrase book these days and working out how far we can get in that one. But are we going to see something? Is it going to happen here? Is it getting bigger and bigger and bigger and unstoppable, and soon it's going to be media frenzy everywhere? So just wanted to understand a little bit more about your thoughts. Yeah, I mean, the UNODC really has the data to prove that it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That's just a matter of fact. Because Hollywood sets the narrative for how we imagine almost everything. We imagine the drug trade as very much centered in Latin America, and it's a very U.S.-centric thing where U.S. is the buyer and Latin America is the producer. I'm not an expert on that part of the world, but one reason you see a lot of violence, especially on the U.S.-Mexico border, is because the Mexican government, with prodded on and supported by the U.S., will go in and wipe out the head of a cartel or the top echelons of a cartel. You can try it in Southeast Asia if you like. Wipe out the head of a major organization and there will be a vacuum. And then other groups will rush in to fill that vacuum, and violence will come along with that. You know, I haven't said anything particularly nice about army-backed militias tonight, but I'm really trying to cover this in a neutral way, as I said in the beginning. I do think that because there is some buy-in from the state, because it's useful to the state, because they have higher objectives just to control that land, that it does add some stability. So the U.S. is not breathing down Myanmar's neck to say, go in and wipe out this guy, this guy, this guy. The DEA has a presence in Myanmar, and they know who is who, and they know where things are moving around. So it's not like this knowledge is not there, but the political relationship between the United States and Myanmar is wildly different from that. And Mexico, which has been a true partner in the drug war. So yes, this region will continue to grow and grow and grow. Will it look like Latin America? No, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. I'm not saying it hasn't been violent, but the level of violence is not quite the same. That said, the civil wars in Myanmar are completely inextractable from drugs. So when you look at the body count there, you can see drugs behind it. But I don't think it's been at the level of, say, the U.S.-Mexico border, when you're looking at in the tens of thousands of deaths, that real churn. I have yet to find someone who is as interested in this part of the world and understands Latin America equally so, to really connect the dots. So I'm just winging it. I'm trying the best I can.
Thank you very much.
Oh, okay. One last one.
Sorry, thank you so much. Oliver Collins here. I'm a Canadian living in Bangkok, and I just had a question for the gentleman in regulatory on the Thai side. Since the advent of the ASEAN Common Market, the free trade zone, and things like normalization of relations with countries like Myanmar, has that made your job harder? Like, is it harder for you to do your job if you want to interdict something in the borderlands? Perhaps a number of decades. I don't know. I'm not an expert, or I haven't studied this in detail, but it seems that prior to the common market, the free trade zone, and the standardizing, the increased diplomatic relations with your neighbors in the region, there must be a lot more political considerations that come into play with you doing your job. I understand it must be helpful in some respects, but is it also a hindrance? Has it become more complicated to say, address some of these issues with neighboring countries, particularly neighboring countries that aren't fully diversified market economies like Thailand, that may be more dependent on revenue streams from things like narcotics trade?
I can start it off and then you can finish it, because I think I got the question.
Sure. Sorry if I didn't articulate that very well.
No. Yeah. It's a really good question. The effect of the ASEAN community and its integration effort on the drug trade.
Exactly. So the people in the front lines, does that impact them in an adverse way in trying to do what they need to do? Particularly when the stakeholders in that common market may be more susceptible to to things like corruption. Than
short answer, yes.
Okay.
But it's like we see in a lot of parts of the world. When you quickly integrate, unless you integrate all your various systems that support that integration, you end up creating risks potentially. And I would say that the ASEAN community has marched ahead very fast to increase trade flows and capital flows across their borders for the purposes of business generation and so on and so forth. But the political security discussions and the integration of their political security efforts can't move at the same pace for different reasons, which is the national security interests. Some of the issues that we're describing are perceived as national security interests in the region, and they therefore move at a very different pace. We try to nurture a discussion every year to get different stakeholders to sit at the same table so that the police and the economic folks understand each other's agenda and therefore try to merge them or bring them together. But the challenge is very significant to do that. So, and we need champions again. Thailand has really helped us with that, and Vietnam this year was trying until COVID because they're the chair of ASEAN. So we're doing that with them. But again, it's really kind of pulling them through that exercise. Like the Europeans have done a hell of a job doing that, integrating their police system with their border system and so on and so forth. But this region has not caught up. And I would point out, drug flows piggyback often on legal trade. So you increase the volume of container traffic or cross-border flights, cross-border people movement, by 15 times over a decade, you increase 15 times the opportunity to move the substance potentially. So it also creates that, and the same with the capital flows. It makes it much more challenging to regulate that space. So, and the systems don't match up. But Thailand's tried in a variety of ways.
Right. For me, I would really only talk about the law enforcement issues. I can guarantee you that between Thailand and Myanmar, we have a good cooperation in terms of the law enforcement, police works. However, the drug problems along the border between Thailand and Myanmar, it's not only it's only because of the drug issue. It may involve or related to the political issues. It may relate to the security issue, which is above from that. It's our hands. Right. It's the government's level. However, in terms of the law enforcement level, operation level, we have a good connections, good cooperations. I can guarantee you that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, on that note, I guess because of the time, I would like to bring the panel to the close. I mean, I would like on behalf of the club and the board and everyone to thank our panelists for, I think, a very excellent discussion on this issue. And I hope all of you here and those of you who are watching on Facebook Live enjoy our panel, and you can enjoy more for those of you who are not members yet. If you subscribe and become members of the FCCT, we have many more events like this in many different areas of interest. And on that note, I would like to thank everyone and thank you ครับขอบคุณมากครับ
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You want to go to Myanmar with me?
Yes, let's go.